Good morning. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. This is our 20th year in the National Joint Registry, so it's a big year for us. We're really grateful for you coming, and I hope you're enjoying your early breakfast. So I'm going to introduce Tim Wilton, who's our Medical Director, and Elaine Young, who's our NJR Director of Operations, and they're going to kick us off this morning. So Elaine is sporting a moon boot, so she's allowed on stage beforehand. So can we have Elaine's slides up? Thanks.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to go through my slides really quickly. I was trying to work out how I would do 20 years of the NJR in 4 to 5 minutes. So the slides I want to show you are really for reference, and I hope you're going to follow up if you're interested in any of them. So the first one is our timeline, the evolution in history. Couldn't possibly get it all on this slide, but it indicates to you that every year we have developed, innovated, created some, pushed the barriers, created some new initiative. But can I commend you all to go to the NJR stand where we have this in detail, and it's really interesting. So please visit our 20th anniversary stand and look at this a little bit more. Okay, in structure and governance, our evolution was we were established and managed by the Department of Health in 2002 following the 3M capital hip failure, and Tim is going to talk in more detail about that. And then we transferred from the DH, and we're currently hosted by HQIP, the Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership. They formed a steering committee, which was a public body, and it was a formal body. We've since been reclassified over time to an NHS England expert committee, still a formal committee, and we still have that line through to NHS England. We were always self-funded, and when the NJR kicked off, it was through a levy. And we changed that to a subscription model with contribution from implant manufacturers, and that enabled us to reduce costs to trusts. Data collection started in 2003 for hip and knee in England and Wales, and we've extended to all joints and geographically as well. And I just wanted to mention, in terms of the structure, a really significant post for us was the establishment of the post of NJR Medical Director in 2013. And our first was Martin Porter, who's here today, and currently Tim Wilton. And it's a really valuable position to us, which is also our Vice Chair. We've developed our committee structure. We always had a committee structure when we were set up, but it wasn't the size it is now. And this defines how we do our work so that we can ensure that the committees are chaired by the right members and have the right membership and for their expertise. So I just wanted to highlight some committees that have developed over the time. The Executive Committee, which allows us to speedier decision making. The Research Committee was set up originally, but it has, with the size of our database now and under the leadership of Mark Wilkinson, it has developed a pace, and that's a really important committee to us. We're about informing through research. Surgical performance, we were set up to manage devices, but then the DH wanted us to expand to surgeon monitoring and unit monitoring. And that's chair is Peter Howard. Medical Advisory Committee came about when we appointed the medical director. Again, a really valuable committee for us because it allows us to have that interaction and communication between the profession and ourselves. And Data Quality Committee, I mentioned, we set this up. This is under the chairmanship of Derek Pegg. We're quite unique in the work that we've actually done on data quality and with data quality audit. We were the first to do anything like this, so we can ensure that the size of our database is also of a certain quality. Ensure that the size of our database is also of a certain quality. Strategic documents, I'm not going to run through any of them in detail, but we wanted our work to be transparent, and so over time we've produced these strategy documents, the main one being the strategic plan, currently 22 to 25, from that our annual work plan, and the rest I commend to you. They're on our website if you're interested to look at them. What do we do with our data? Huge database. So we've actually developed, again, I'm not going to run through them in any detail. There's our annual report, which we're launching here to you today, but there's also feedback systems for management and trusts, surgeons you will all know, suppliers, etc. And again, you can go online to find out more detail. So 20 years on, where are we? Well, we're the largest database of this kind in the world, and we currently have circa 3.7 million on our database. We are recognised as a global exemplar of an implantable medical devices registry. We have huge international influence now and are working with international partners to share best practice. And we use our data to enable excellent patient outcomes and set the research agenda. I'm not going to go through all of the future. We still have a huge agenda that we're excited to address. But one of the main things I put on the list is our alignment and collaboration going forward with NHS England and Tim Briggs and Scott Pride with the development of the National Medical Devices database. And we're excited about going forwards with that. Thank you very much. I told you it was whistle stop, and I shall hand over to Tim.
Thanks very much, Elaine. Well, I'm going to try and go briefly over the core business. What I regard as our core business is the implant outlier detection, and let you know in what sort of ways that's changed over the last 20 years, just with 3 brief illustrations. These are my disclosures. I don't think any of them are particularly relevant other than the fact that I am the medical director of the NJR. As you heard, the NJR was set up because of the 3M's hip disaster, and this was a major disaster, but I'd just like to briefly go through some of the timeline. You see that it was introduced in 1991, and it was introduced as a cheap, literally, they advertised it to the surgeons as being a cheap alternative to the Charnley hip. It was an alternative. Unfortunately, it wasn't a Charnley hip. And that proved to be the case very rapidly. Within 2 years, people were starting to say, is this really doing the job as it should? And within 4 years, there were presentations at the BOA Congress that year saying there are seriously bad results from some of these devices. It took another 18 months for that to be monitored carefully, and another 18 months of monitoring before the Medical Devices Agency, as it then was, actually issued a safety notice, and a call line, a helpline was set up for all of the patients who had it. A report was then done through the Royal College, which took another 3 years and didn't report until 2001, and that therefore was about 6 years after the papers were read at the BOA saying that there was a problem. And so there were many things to try and get better when the NJR was established the following year. And this is what happened to the capital hip. So this is before HN and after HN, just to show you what happens when we issue a safety notice. The failure rate was 15% by 6 years before the hazard notice was issued, and went up to 26% and dropped very much sooner after the implantation, after the hazard notice was issued. You can see this didn't apply across the board. There were monoblock round-back devices, and they had very good results, and they didn't get any worse after the hazard notice. And there were modular flange designs, which were disastrous and got even more disastrous after the hazard notice. So we could already find out from this, even before we had the NJR, that there are certain things that obviously don't work. Without prospective collection of the data, the analysis and assessment may take many years and is always going to be way in retrospect. And implants outcomes may no longer be accurately assessed once a hazard notice has been issued, because you don't know what the effect of the hazard notice has been on the failure rate. We can't also be certain about what effect it may have that there have been informal notifications, for example, papers at Congress and so forth, and what effect that has on the results. And we have to pay attention to variance, because just having a brand name doesn't mean that the design is the same for everything within the brand, and clearly it isn't. So the next stage was metal on metal, which it was unfortunate metal on metal problems in this country, because it happened that the usage grew very rapidly in the early 2000s and peaked at about 2007, as you see here. And that was actually before we were formally doing outlier analysis, which started the following year. But in any case, we did do outlier analysis. We would like to have done better. The Australians had already noted that there was a problem with metal-on-metal hips by 2009 and had reported it to their authorities and elsewhere. And we would have liked to have defined the problems with the metal-on-metal hips sooner than we actually managed, which was to say fairly definitively in 2011 what the problem was. But why didn't this happen? Well, first of all, it was the slow uptake of compliance. At the time, compliance with the registry was not compulsory and not mandated by the government. And it was a slow increase over the first 5 years, with only 40% compliance in the first year. But also 2 very high volume units who did mostly metal-on-metal hips actually didn't put any of their data into the NJR for the first few years. And that seriously hampered our interrogation of the data. Nevertheless, it was actually the data from the NJR which ultimately demonstrated globally that there was a serious problem with metal-on-metal total hips and a particular problem with some of the resurfacing hips as well. And you can see there the growth of compliance during the first few years. And it wasn't until 2014, at the end of that chart, that the government actually made it mandatory to put patients into the NJR, by which time pretty much everybody was doing it anyway. So our assessment of implant outlier status, we know that problems can't be detected before there's evidence. I mean, you can smell a funny smell sometimes. You may be given the impression that there might be a problem, but to prove that there's a problem requires that you have enough evidence, and you have to set what level of evidence you want. But it does require excellent completeness of the data. We can look for early warning systems, and we have some of those in place. Lowering the threshold for signal detection will tend to let us know about things earlier, but it also tends to let us know about things which may not be a problem because the confidence intervals are so wide. So really, only persistent vigilance and a flexible approach to that analysis and to the thresholds will result in the maximum protection of patients. And we can, by international cooperation, increase the numbers and therefore lower the confidence intervals. But that does require that every registry is actually talking about exactly the same variant of exactly the same implant. And that's not always easy to ascertain. But one of the ways that we now screen for possible problems is that the industry gets sent regular monthly updates on the PMS data for their devices. And we can screen these and look for example, as you see here in red, this particular hip has a particularly high failure rate for alval type problems. And therefore, if you screen for that, you may say this is something that we need to look into in much more detail. So how do we do now? The NJR case acquisition is 97 to 98% and has been consistently for the last 10 years because we've entered into the auditing of every hospital's cases, as Elaine mentioned. And a recent result of this was that there was one of the tibial components of the next-gen system was withdrawn as a result of the analysis brought about through the data in the NJR. But the next-gen brand is not an outlier. And in fact, the 2 particular variants with the worst results are also not yet outliers by the criteria that we use. But we saw that there was a particular problem with the implant failing through aseptic loosening, and the tibial component was withdrawn because of that. And as a result, hopefully there will now be considerable reduction in the failure rate for that overall brand. So we are doing better. We routinely scrutinize these PMS reports. We do liaise with other registries around the country, around the world, to see if they have any concerns, and they liaise with us when they do have those concerns. We're refining the analysis to use Kaplan-Meier, and we're reviewing the appropriate comparators and thresholds on a regular basis in case it would be helpful to change these. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Tim and Elaine. I'd like to introduce Gillian Coward to you now. And Gillian is one of our patient representatives, and she was very, very keen to get here today, but she's unfortunately unwell and not able to get here in person. But she has recorded this video for you. And I'd just like you to consider that she's not a professional broadcaster, but I was very impressed by the quality of what she did. So can we play Gillian's video, please?
I would like to review the major benefits to patients of 20 years of National Joint Registry activity and how I got involved. In January 2014, I was in Barcelona and very unfortunately fell and broke my left hip. I was very well cared for in a big city hospital, and after a hip replacement, some days later, was able to fly home to Northern Ireland. Happily, my new hip has caused me no problems in the last 9 years. Having my surgery outside the UK means my operation and implant are not tracked and recorded in the National Joint Registry. Remembering the hours experiencing the worst pain of my life, lying on a trolley in Spanish A&E, being excluded from the NJR database was not concerning me at the time. However, when I got home, I did become more curious about my new hip, which hopefully is going to be inside me for the rest of my life. On discharge from hospital in Spain, I had received detailed descriptions of every single component of the implant and my treatment. A friend encouraged me to learn more through ODEP and exploring National Joint Registry publications. I came to realize the value of the registry, not just to reassure trauma patients, but even more so for those scheduled for elective joint surgery. And it was around that time that I joined the NJR as a very curious patient representative. The collection and analysis of the huge volume of joint surgery data over the last 20 years has created a registry of international standing. This is based on observations of implant performance and research outputs impacting on clinical practice. But it's not just a shiny trophy to polish now and then. It's like a navigation system guiding us safely into the future, using robust evidence of best practice and best performing implants. And that's why it's so valuable for patients. Because firstly, it is important that patients have confidence in their surgeons and implants being used. When poor performance of either is observed, the NJR takes swift action through its accountability and transparency model, a sort of well-organized early warning system of alerts and alarms, to raise their concerns to hospitals and the appropriate regulatory authorities, ensuring that actions are taken to reduce risk and prioritize patient safety. During years volunteering with Versus Arthritis, I have met many people waiting for joint replacement. And sadly, in Northern Ireland, we endure the longest waiting times across the UK nations. Before surgery, we want as much reliable and authoritative information as we can gather about what surgery will involve and how far it might fix our painful, non-functioning joint. Being well-informed and confident to ask questions enables us to participate actively in discussions about surgery, recovery, and rehabilitation, and could mean greater understanding and therefore more realistic expectations regarding outcomes. So secondly, as patients, we appreciate the effort the National Joint Registry has made over the years to share what they have learned by publishing clear guidance to patients and the public in a range of formats and platforms. The National Joint Registry website now includes a patient portal for access to a wide range of helpful information and patient experiences. More recently, it includes a link to the innovative and interactive patient decision support tool built around NJR data. Dare we imagine the challenges the next 20 years might bring? I think the National Joint Registry will be continuing to maintain its high standards of methodical data collection and generating quality research evidence to improve clinical practice and implant choice. This in turn feeds back to the orthopaedic profession itself, further raising standards and transparency. Finally, The National Joint Registry has always involved patients through meetings, dialogues, and representation on their committees, and we look forward to the ambitious plans to expand this aspect of their work in the next few months. Thank you, NJR, and good luck for the next 20 years.
Okay, so Gillian is one of our patient representatives, and Robin Britton is our other patient representative, and he's going to introduce our next speaker as well with some words. And the speaker he's introducing is Andy Price, who needs no introduction to this audience, I think.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Robin Britton, and I'm a patient representative for the National Joint Registry. The Cumberlege Review examined how the healthcare system in England responds to reports about harmful side effects from medicines and medical devices. It came about because of raised concerns and complaints by patients and patient groups, and through long-standing campaigns, some lasting decades, by those who felt that they were not being listened to or acknowledged, and this was an overarching theme of the review. It focused on 3 different interventions: 2 medicines and 1 medical device, each with particular raised issues and sharing striking similarities in effects and warnings in use. These were hormone pregnancy tests, sodium valproate used in pregnancy, and pelvic mesh implants. What became evident in each was that patients were unable to make informed treatment choices because clinicians failed to give them sufficient information about possible risks and rates of complications. For that reason, the review declared that patients' and families' voices, experiences, and views to be at the heart of the review. It was asked to consider how to strengthen the patient voice in order to help to build a system which listens, hears, and acts with speed, compassion, and proportionality. Commenting on the published report, Baroness Cumberlege emphasised the impact of those involved, reflecting on harrowing stories of relationships destroyed, careers broken, and as a result, financial ruin with no income. Many lost their homes and faced their children being taken into care. The review found that patients and the public should not have to take matters into their own hands and to find the evidence on safety and risks of treatments. A healthcare system should be collating that data to spot any trends and red flags, enabling swift action to protect patients. The report mentions duty of candour, meaning clinicians tell patients when things have gone wrong, and the need to create a healthcare system where professionals are confident they can be open and honest with the aim of preventing future harm. The report strongly emphasised that patients or their families should not be left to join up the dots of patient safety. A recommendation of Cumberlege was for database and registry use, with a database holding patient-related datasets with patient details and treatment information linking to patient-identifiable registries being pivotal to research and audit outcomes for device safety and patient feedback on their treatment, which can be interrogated over time to assure long-term efficiency and to detect harm. However, this was not the first time the use of data had been identified and recommended to prevent harm and improve patient outcomes. There was the Patterson inquiry and a report into issues raised about the surgeon Ian Patterson and malpractice allegations. While not specifying registry use as such, the inquiry recommended a single repository of information for the collection and use of consultant performance data to drive better quality clinical practice through evidence. So what about the role of the NJR and importance to patients? The NJR collects, analyses, monitors and reports on joint surgery in terms of hospital, surgeon, manufactured implant and patient outcomes and safety. It represents the interests of patients, in a sense being a voice, ensuring they get the best outcomes from surgery, which is effective and safe. The data can support clinical practice, implant design, research into different subject areas, and information for patients and clinicians with shared decision-making. The NJR has been leading on this work for a significant time, this year being its 20th anniversary. The role of the NJR was recognised by Cumberlege. It gave evidence at the oral hearings, and it was said, "You run a very good registry, which is why we want to hear from you." In the published report and findings, the NJR was identified as a leader in its field and being an exemplar registry with world-leading expertise. In the subsequent published government response and implementation reports, the NJR was described as being regarded as setting international best practice in analysing outcomes for device procedures. The Cumberlege Review considered whether all the right data is collected. A number of witnesses who gave evidence stressed the importance of collecting data far more widely and routinely than at present, and for including health outcomes as perceived by patients. A recommendation of the Cumberlege Report is that patient-reported outcomes, or PROMs, should form part of the assessment of the benefit and risks of treatment. The NJR records whether a patient undergoes repeated operations or revisions as a measure of outcomes. PROMs is a missing link which provides input direct from patients about how they feel and function in relation to surgery, and focusing on outcomes being important to them, such as pain and function. The NJR would like to manage the collection of PROMs across all joint replacements recorded in the registry. At present, it only manages those for shoulders. This would amplify the patient voice, being additional to collected performance data. Currently, hip and knee PROMs are collected and managed by the NHS. I would now like to invite Professor Andrew Price to talk more on Cumberlege. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robin. That's a great introduction to this whole topic of PROMs and registry collection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the interaction with the NJR and PROMs and what the future might look like, and perhaps some of the exciting opportunities and then some of the challenges. So as Robin's already alluded to, the NJR has had a long track record with already dealing with PROMs. PROMs, you'll see, it comes out in provider and surgeon level data reports and in research. And in many ways, I think a lot of people assume that the NJR is collecting and delivering PROMs. And in fact, a lot of people have said that to me. That's an interesting reflection. The key bit, and Robin's pointed it out for me, is that the PROM collection is a really key part of the evolution of our understanding of what is success after joint replacement. So whether or not your outcome measure, whether you make a decision about whether a treatment for someone has been a success or not, if you say it's just dependent on revision, you are missing quite a bit of the story, because it might not be a success for someone who's not revised if they regret having had the operation because they still have residual pain. Now, one of the advantages we have is that for quite a long time, PROMs has already been collected in the UK. And there is this link between the National Joint Registry and the collection of PROMs. But it's clear that we should understand that that's an indirect link. So the NJR does not collect PROMs. It deals with PROMs that are collected by the NHS, and I'll come to that, by NHS Digital. So in fact, you need to go back to 2008 and the Darcy report, where it was stated that to measure the success of operations as reported by patients themselves, that's what he wanted. That's why PROMs were introduced. And you can see we've sort of, how much further have we got when you get to the Cumberlege report, because the same thing's being repeated, saying you need patient-reported outcome measures. But what happened was that we had mandatory PROM collection. It was a population-based program, not focused on the individual. That's really key. So the aim of the audit was to be able to make population calculations around hip and knee replacement, the success of it. And there was a separate national reporting structure set up within NHS Digital, It was based around, these are the hip and knee scores that came in. Of course, at the same time, there was also PROM collection for varicose veins and for hernia repair, they've both subsequently stopped, which is interesting if you reflect that mesh is used for hernia repair. So they decommissioned that about 5 years ago. So National Hip and PROMS audit goes ahead. You're aware it's this sort of very patient-focused questionnaire that Robin's talking to, key part of understanding the outcome, and the sort of outputs that you get that they were really designed for were this sort of thing. This is a comparison across providers with data, which allows you to make some decisions about how well a system, this is population-based medicine, a system is working. Now, you need to understand what the pathway of PROMS and how and how data was collected. And this is somewhat, when you look at this, when you first look at it, it is somewhat bizarre that this is how it ended up. In modern practice at the moment, patients go through this pathway that you'll all recognize. Say you have a hip or a knee replacement. There's routine 6-week follow-up in most places. Beyond that, a lot of follow-up has been decommissioned. In the place I work, there is no further follow-up outside 6 weeks. That's pretty common. So that doesn't really fit with Cumberlege. That's an interesting comment that we don't follow people up. On top of that, Q1 PROM is collected preoperatively, and the structure was that it's done by providers external to the hospital, and they're not allowed to share the data with the hospital at that moment in time. So it's not contemporaneous with your clinical care. What happens then is the patient, independent of your clinical, care that's going on, gets a questionnaire at 6 months. That's the Q2 that they fill in, and that goes back to the central NHS repository. There is no action based on your outcome. So if you're doing poorly, nothing happens. So I think as a patient experience, that must be very odd for someone measures your outcome, you understand you're not doing well, but nothing happens. So you need a new pathway, and the opportunity is now with Cumberlege to think about how we do this, because I think this is what Cumberlege is really talking about. So in other words, you need the Q1 embedded into clinical care. So you need to make it a mandatory, I'll use that word, but you need to make it an established part of the way we manage patients. So you have a starting point. You need to have the Q2 as a mandatory part of clinical care, but not siloed in the way it is now. It needs to be connected with the patient. The patient needs to understand about that. You probably need to understand that you're going to need to feed back to the patient. That is what Cumberlege asks for. It isn't just that you get PROMs into registries. Cumberlege says you need to feed that information back to the patient. And then you need to use the outcome data in your assessment of what success looks like. So I think that's Cumberlege compliant, but we're a long way from that in our routine practice. I think that probably should be mandatory for all implantable devices. So that is a big statement, because there's some real issues with that. I'll point out a few of the issues, and this is I've been interested in PROMs for a long time, so for me, it's amazing that we've got to this spot. But there are a lot of things to think about. So I'm going to talk about consent, uptake, clinical feedback, and the management of the PROMs program. So many of you won't have read this. This is the consent in the front of a PROM that's collected by the patient. An interesting anecdote, and I'm sorry if I overrun, was that Ray Fitzpatrick, who was basically the godfather of PROMs, created the Oxford Hip and Knee Score, had a hip replacement. He doesn't mind me telling this story. And he was given his Oxford Hip Score. And he told me anecdotally afterwards, when it was given to him, the person who gave it to him says, "I've no idea why we're doing this," and gave him the PROM. So that gives you an idea about how this sort of fits in. But look at the consent form. You have to consent to allow your data to be shared with the clinicians who are looking after you. So it is directly driven as not within your clinical care, which is quite extraordinary, really, when you think, why wouldn't this be in the patient's clinical care? So the way it's set up at the moment, we're going to need to change. These are the uptake figures. It's 65% for hip replacements. This is a pre- and post-op PROM. And interestingly, it's 65% for knee replacements. That gives you a kind of interesting insight. And everybody looks at that and goes, that's terrible. What's interesting in population science, that's really good. So if you want to try and, it's unbelievably good, really, in terms of what you would normally get. You'd be happy with less than 50% on population, if you're doing population analysis. That's a problem for us if you're going to use it on an individual basis. So you need to understand what you do about missing data and how you could optimize that. Some work I've been involved in, if you integrate the PROM into the patient pathway, so in other words, what about if the letter comes from the surgeon who's operated on you to fill out the PROM rather than an independent body, you can change that figure. Patient feedback, and I think this is probably the most important bit. If you look at some of the work that came out of Bristol, I was involved in this, this is an NJR package looking at painful knee replacements. And what they did is they looked at how patients who had painful knee replacements, not going to get operated on, but how they're managed. And what they realized is that patients needed more support. So that whole bit about recognizing your poor outcome, there was no feedback loop to get back into the system. So Cumberlege, this demonstrated that we do a poor job from a Cumberlege perspective in looking after these people. And finally, come back to this slide. So we have to understand that these are independent processes at the moment. And there has to be some way of bringing these things closer together. And it's been worked on now, but there are real challenges. So as we stand at the moment, the NJR doesn't have access to routine PROMS data for our analysis. And you'll look in the 2003 annual report, there's a lack of PROMS data. And that's due to the complexity of bringing these big siloed work streams together. But I think the opportunity is massive. And I think patient safety is really the key to this. And I think you've already heard from both our patient representatives about what the good work the NJR has done and how we were referenced in Cumberlege. But I think, as Robin points out, there's still a lot of work to do in trying to get this right. So I'll just leave you with that message. There's still work to do. Thank you very much.
Robin, Andrew, thank you very, very much for that. We're now going to hear an interview which was conducted by a patient about our performance monitoring role, and she's interviewing Peter Howard. So if we can play Sally's video, that'll be great.
Hi, Peter. My name is Sally. I was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis when I was 11 years old. Unfortunately, I was diagnosed a long time before the new treatments were available to me. And although my arthritis is well under control now, I was left with significant joint damage, which has resulted in me having 7 joint replacements by the time I was 41. So what is the NJR and why was it established?
Okay, well, nice to meet you, Sally. The NJR is a large organisation, and at the heart of it is a very large database which contains all the details of the joints and the replacements and patients that have been carried out from about 2003 onwards. It came into being from things that happened about 6 years previous to that. There was a hip replacement brand which basically was unsuccessful. It's called the Capital Hip. And it only became apparent that this was not working well by a series of unconnected reports from different hospitals, small series that were reported. And when put together, it was evident that there was a big problem. And this was how it tended to happen in those days. The implant was recalled. And one of the big problems that became apparent was that 20% of the patients that seemed to have had the implants couldn't be traced, or 20% of the implants, we couldn't find a patient that they'd gone into. And this was clearly unsatisfactory and that patient safety required improvement.
I do remember that happening, actually. So how does the NJR look after the interests of patients?
Well, with the huge amount of data accumulated, not only can it assess implants with poor performance and they can be detected earlier, but we can reliably trace the patients instantly. And that's not just if it's an implant brand that's going wrong. It's if there's a minor recall on any small bit that might not be sterilized or have incorrect bearing surface. And we can find those patients straight away and the correct things can be, actions can be taken. we look at the data regularly to assess performance on an ongoing basis, both implants and units, actually. And we report the outcomes of the implants through the annual report. And the Surgical Performance Committee alerts surgeons and hospitals if they've got higher than expected rates. The Implant Scrutiny Committee, if it identifies poor performance, reports the MHRA, and that's the route by which an implant would get withdrawn if necessary.
So when thinking about revision surgery, and I try not to think about it too much, what are the NJR doing for people like me who have had several of them already?
Right. Well, revision surgery presents us with a really much bigger challenge for assessing and improving outcomes. And the reason for that is that revisions are so much different, and it's different to classify and categorize them so that you can compare like with like. Most surgeons do quite a lot of primaries and not as many revisions. So they accumulate numbers more slowly, and they tend to accumulate them for a diverse number of causes. But as data is accumulating, we are able to assess which implants are performing better in a revision context, whatever that context might be, however complicated it is. And so we are slowly applying that level of scrutiny as well. And for implant companies that use their implants, that data is available in comparison to implants of similar natures. So it's there, but just by nature of the fact we had to have 5 years worth of primary data before we could report, and revisions are only 10% of the overall surgeon operations. It takes that much longer to assess how good it is in a more diverse patient group.
So how has joint replacement surgery changed over the last 20 years?
In some ways, quite a lot. In some ways, not very much. I think a lot of the basic surgical techniques remain very much the same. If you look at the implants we use now, you'd be pushed to say they look a great deal different from what went in back then. So most of the changes we've seen are gradual, and some of them are largely attributable to the NJR, but others aren't. But the best example, perhaps, is that the NJR really identified the poor performance of most metal-on-metal hip replacements just over 10 years ago. And that directly led to it stopping, and I think probably stopping sooner than would otherwise have happened. The availability of large volume real-world data to surgeons and providers really leads them to be able to make much more informed choices about what implants they're going to use and perhaps how they're going to use them. And I think it's very noteworthy that since we commenced feeding back data to surgeons and to hospitals in 2009 onwards, to both units and surgeons, we've seen a continuous improvement in overall results. This is something that's never been previously available to surgeons, to the vast majority anyway, so that they've been able to scrutinize what implants they use, what techniques they use. And we feel that that is perhaps been one of the major achievements to date.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you for everything that you do.
Okay, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Lovely comment at the end there. So if I can just invite the speakers up, please, and also Mark and Peter. I know you've spoken as well. Right, bit of a shortage of space up here. Okay, so we're going to do Q&A session now. We're really, really keen to hear from the floor. This is your opportunity to ask any questions. Hopefully they won't be too difficult for us or embarrassing. Yes, far away. Thank you.
William Tice from Southampton. I think most of us in the room are now aware of the high failure rate of a particular combination of the next-gen total knee arthroplasty. But the NJR were aware of this some time ago, and I believe that it was maybe 2015 that they informed the MHRA of this concern. But that never went any further. So we as surgeons continue to blindly put this implant combination in. Moving forward, if a similar problem were to occur in that the NJR found an implant that was poorly performing and informed the MHRA, might they not inform the surgeons as well?
So I think that's going to go either to Peter or Tim. Does one of you want to put your hand up for that one?
probably both, but
Both of you.
start.
I'll kick off. To some extent, that now happens, actually. We have a system whereby every 6 months, if a surgeon uses an implant that's been declared an outlier, they get a notification to tell them that's what they're doing. And that applies to whatever the reason for that. It's slightly more difficult when we're dealing with one part of a huge family of knee replacements, but that's not going to be necessary for the next gen because the offending implant's been withdrawn. But there are some implants out there which are outliers, and sometimes it's because they're used in complex primary surgery cases only with maybe an expected higher failure rate. But we do know that some surgeons, believe it or not, don't read the annual report. That they're not necessarily absolutely aware that something is an outlier. So we simply notify them. We're not saying don't use it. We're saying you should be aware of it. So that's our action on implants that get declared as being outliers. And we've been running that now for about 2.5 years, I think it is.
And we do have a closer relationship with the MHRA than we used to have. And so, as I think you're aware, that members of the MHRA who are to do with the device failure and safety are sitting on our implant scrutiny committee all the time. So they see these discussions and they see these arguments happening. And the other thing that we're changing at the moment, although we have to figure out exactly how to make sure that the right people can get hold of this information and other people might not be able to get hold of it, is that we produce the PMS reports and other summary reports on a regular basis for all of the implants that are in the joint registry. And we're trying to find ways where we can make the surgeons be able to look at those, although there are lots of them, and the surgeons are probably not routinely going to go and look at them all. But what we hope is that surgeons will go and look at the summary reports of the ones that they use, because they show a great deal more detail than simply, is this an outlier? Is this nearly an outlier? And to be clear, I mentioned yesterday, actually the two variant combinations of femoral and tibial components of the next gen, which were the most alarming and which led us to ask Bristol and Robert Scott to do this much more in-depth analysis that we did of 88 different variants. Those two worst variants are still not outliers by our criteria. And so we seriously have to look at whether that's a problem with our outlier process. It's an accepted process which is accepted across the world, that most people think that you ought to have 100% increase in the failure rate before it's regarded as being an outlier. And many of us, I think Peter and I included, are not at all certain that that's a satisfactory threshold.
Okay, so does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's very reassuring.
Okay, thank you. So Tony, a brief question if you would.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing that the NJR 20 years, I was sort of involved a lot with the problems of the ASR linking into the NJR and MHRA. The NJR is trying to detect problems early, and from looking at what's happened with the next gen, I think things are better than they were 10 or 15 years ago. Are we missing a little trick in terms of explant analysis? And NJR is looking at things which have a slightly higher failure rate, wondering if it's a problem. But is there a mechanism to feed into the explant centres? Because we at North Tees, when we analyse things, we get a little early idea that there may be a problem, and that might help the NJR, and I don't know what mechanisms are in place to link that information in.
Tim.
Well, I think you're aware of the answer to this question because you're involved, but there is a new setup which has some agreement from some parties in NHS England, where there should be, and hopefully will shortly be, a national system for taking these devices and either analysing them in that system or passing them to other areas and other implant retrieval centres which can do the same sort of work. I think that the plan is half formed at the moment, and hopefully it will be fully formed. When I was on the MHRA Medical Devices Committee, they looked at 14,000 complaints a year about devices which had failed. But of course, their devices were anything from plugs, syringe injectors, wheelchairs, plates, screws, everything we use, but everything every other type of physician uses. And they only had 14,000 complaints a year. Well, we had 14,000 hip and knee revisions that year. And we think that probably maybe 1 or 2% of those were reported. It's partly our duty to report those. If we don't report them to the MHRA, if we don't submit those devices for analysis, then we can't really expect to benefit, and the patients won't benefit from that analysis.
Great.
Okay, so we probably have room for another question if anyone's asking. I think David's going to ask us a question.
David Johnson from Stockport. You may or may not be aware, but Stryker have withdrawn the Avon patellofemoral replacement. We got 3 weeks' notice for this. We're scrabbling around to getting our patients that are on the list through and get their implant. We have no idea whether they've got any plans to continue providing it, but this is the best performing patellofemoral replacement in the NJR and the longest survivorship data. Does the NJR have a role in making sure that the best performing implant of this brand or this type is maintained in production and not withdrawn purely for commercial reasons?
Right. That's going to be you again, Tim, I think.
I think we have a role, and I think that role is to demonstrate the efficacy or lack of efficacy of those devices and the failure rates, either according to revision rates or according to the PROMs and other things that Andrew was talking about earlier. But I don't think that we have any power to say, you have to go on producing this device. And the simple fact that it has less bad results than other patellofemoral replacements doesn't mean that we can force the company to go on producing it. I do think it's a problem, and it's a particular problem when they decide to do it to the device which appears to have better results rather than less good results.
It seems to be the timing is particularly problematic, isn't it? If they're saying we're withdrawing this in 3 weeks, it leaves us in a really difficult situation as surgeons, I think.
I think the BOA has a role in doing so, and they're trying to do so. But they've been arguing about some of the issues surrounding the new regulations in Europe for 5 years, and I'm not sure the EU is listening to what happens in this country very much any longer.
Okay, looks like the boss has come in.
Yeah. Deborah's going to answer.
So, but we want to hear, the BOA wants to hear about all these implants that you're having trouble with. We are working more closely with ABHI to develop pathways that will give us advance notice about that. We are pushing with MHRA, but all I can say is at least they're talking to us now, which they weren't really talking to us before. So the more information we have, the better we can help each other deal with it, I think, but no answers, sorry.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So, right, we're going to move on to section 2 now. So I'll ask the speakers to decamp from the seats at the front. We'll start filling them up again.
And I'm going to introduce Mike, who's doing the rest of this next session.
Right, good. I've been introduced. Thank you. So could I have my slides up? So the NJR report takes a year to produce, and it's produced by a big team of people. And I need to tell you about that in the next 4.5 minutes. So this is our 20th year, as you know, and with this year's annual report, we produced 97% of the 2019 activity. So not quite full recovery. I'm pleased to say that in the first 5 months of this year, it's the busiest that the NJR has ever been in terms of numbers submitted looking at the data. So we are still the biggest, but the other registries are closing in. The North American registries are growing. So this is the feature from the HIP report, which I thought was a key to just to point out to people. And this is the activity by year over the last, the last 20 years. And what you can see is in purple there is NHS activity. So that's NHS operations in NHS hospitals. And the depressing thing is that this has been declining since 2014. And actually now we're at 2007 levels of NHS activity for hip replacement. And the rest of the activity has been picked up in the independent sector. And the other notable thing I would say is that in 2022, there was double the amount of private practice hip replacements compared to 2019, which is not a great reflection, I think, on where we are as a health service, because this is a time of austerity, it's a time of cost of living crisis, and yet people are still having to pay privately. So in knee, we have a large number of brands now with failure rates of less than 4% at 15 years, some great choices. It's clear that overall, non-patella resurfaced knee replacements, cemented constrained knee replacements, have a higher revision rate. But it is very brand specific. So before you change your practice, I'd recommend that you look up your particular brand, because it may not be the case in that brand. Posterior stabilized knees have a higher revision rate. Unicompartmental knees are much improved. They still have a higher revision rate. And it's important to note that they don't behave like primaries in terms of their tendency for re-revision. There is a sort of an urban myth that they behave like a primary, and that isn't the case in the data. So ankle. Now, the ankle replacement surgeons have actually played a blinder, because there was a new implant introduced, I think, back in 2014, which was widely adopted. And it's the orange line right on the bottom of that failure rate chart there. It's been widely adopted and it's done extremely well. So there's been a big stroke of luck there, and I think that's really great news for the ankle replacement surgeons, and very low failure rates comparatively to previously. At 7 years, there's a 5% failure rate. There is concern, and the paper is actually featured in the annual report, that we're not capturing all of the revisions of ankles, particularly the arthrodeses. So at 10 years, you're probably adding sort of 4 or 5% extra to these charts. That's featured in the annual report. In elbows, the most notable thing to me as a hip surgeon was the variability in the numbers done by each surgeon by region. So in Wales, there's a median of 2 elbow replacements done by the elbow surgeons, whereas in South Central it's 11. So it's a great variability in the numbers that are being done, and these are very expert operations done by a few surgeons. I think of note for me in shoulder was the PROMS. Firstly, the PROMS completion rate is notably low, about 10%. And Andrew told us it's about 65% in hip and knee replacement. The other thing is that it seems that those that fill in the PROM, which is in blue there, have a different revision rate to those that don't. So there is that slight discrepancy, and there's a view here that the people that fill in the PROMS reports are not exactly representative of the whole patient cohort. Interestingly, they do catch up at 10 years, and it's the same revision rate amongst PROMS fillers and PROMS non-fillers. Just to point out, there's some key papers that are highlighted in this year's annual report. One is about the effect of NHS commissioner policies on BMI, very worthwhile reading. How long do revised hips last, and how long do ankle replacements last? And I've just talked a bit about that as well. And we've also got a couple of papers from the NJR Sustainability Surgery Fellows. We're going to hear from one of those a little bit later on. And there is a large number of referenced articles. Every year we get lots and lots of papers from NJR data. It's all in the annual report for you to look up. So thank you very much. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to introduce Rohan Prakash, who is one of 2 NJR BOA sustainability fellows. We've got two fellows that were jointly appointed by the BOA and the NJR, and so Rowan's going to tell us about his project.
Perfect. Good morning. My name is Rohan Prakash. I'm an ST6 based in Birmingham, and as Prof said, one of this year's Sustainability Fellows. So I'll talk a bit about our pilot work and then our plans for the rest of the year. So we know that the NHS is producing 500,000 tonnes of waste every year and 25 megatons of carbon dioxide. And in context, what that means is that's more than a third of the UK's public sector emissions. Now, within the hospital, surgery is up to 6 times more energy intense than any other department, which is why there's been a particular focus in this area. And the reason that sustainability is so important at the moment is obviously because of the NHS's pledge to be net zero by 2045. Now, within orthopaedic subspecialties, we know that arthroplasty produces more surgical waste than any other. And it's important to bear in mind, on a trust level, that this has environmental benefits, of course, but also financial implications if we can improve our waste management and segregation in arthroplasty cases. So our pilot study at the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital in Birmingham was a small study where we aimed to just quantify how much waste are we producing from a primary hip and primary knee. We quantified the different waste streams and looked at how much waste was being recycled. We then tried to identify strategies to improve this, and ultimately this led to us assessing the effect of real-time waste segregation and seeing if that really made a difference. So we did a prospective study in summer of 22. We looked at only primary hips and primary knees, and we excluded complex cases and revision cases. We categorized the waste into 5 main categories. That's general or non-hazardous waste, hazardous or infectious waste, recycling sharps and linens, and at the end of each case weighed the different streams and then looked in more detail at the general waste to see how much of this was actually recyclable and was it being recycled. This is just a picture from our theatres highlighting those different waste streams that we talked about. Now, this is a very busy slide, but just to summarize, looking at our hip replacements, on average, we're producing just under 15 kilograms of waste. And amongst this, we're recycling less than half a kilogram. Looking at our knees, we're producing more waste, just over 17 kilograms, and we're recycling less than a single kilogram. Now, on average, therefore, we're recycling less than 3% of our waste in hips and just over 5% in our knees. Hazardous waste, surprisingly, made up the most of this and was 70% approximately, with general waste being the next biggest category. Looking at more detail at the general waste, we found that only 2 items in our hips were actually labelled as recyclable, and only 1 item was recyclable in our knee replacements. And the majority of the general waste was made up of glove packaging and such instruments, but also the sterile blue wrap that lines the surgical instrument trays. Now, to put these results in context, based on our results, doing 4 total hips under spinal is the equivalent of flying from London to Edinburgh in terms of the carbon dioxide production, and that's only from the waste generated. So we're doing more than 190,000 hips and knees annually in the UK. Based on our initial results, we suggest that we're producing more than 3 million kilograms of waste from these procedures alone, yet we're recycling a very small amount of this. And this is an issue because we know that recycled waste has the lowest carbon footprint. The other issue highlighted by our study was that we were incorrectly segregating our waste. In our study, 50% of the cases had the non-contaminated surgical tray wrapping sheets disposed of in the hazardous waste or the orange bins, as you'll see in theatre, and this is an issue. This is an issue because the Brighton group have shown that hazardous waste generates more than 10 times the amount of carbon dioxide compared with recycled waste. This is because they go into high temperature incinerators. It's also a cost issue. Disposing of 1 bag of hazardous waste in our trust costs 3 times that of a general waste bag. And there have been studies to show that you can reduce your operating room waste disposal costs by up to 60% just with diligent segregation alone. So our main take-home message from our pilot study was that we need to be diligent with our waste segregation and ultimately reduce the amount of unnecessary hazardous waste that we're producing. Any recyclable packaging must be recycled, but there's a real issue with medical suppliers not labeling items as recyclable or not. So the next step was to do a study looking at the effect of real-time waste segregation in theatre to see if that made a difference. So we invited our waste management lead for the trust down to theatre to tell us exactly what needs to go in which bin and how we should be doing things. And we looked at 10 hips and 10 knees and had an unscrubbed team member, largely myself, segregating the waste into the appropriate streams. What we showed is you can reduce your hazardous waste by approximately 20% with diligent waste segregation alone, and we reduced the total waste by a smaller amount. Now, extrapolating this, if everyone were to divert 20% of their waste from the hazardous waste to the general waste, that equates to 320,000 kilograms of CO2 a year, but in context, that's the same as someone flying from London to New York every single day of the year. So therefore, our next step, which is what we're going to be doing in the coming months, is the waste study, so the Waste Segregation Trainee Evaluation Study. And this is a multi-centre study with support from the Birmingham and North East Research Collaboratives. It'll be a prospective waste audit where we'll be asking the different units with varying practices to collect collect data on how much waste they're producing. And ultimately, our aim is to define waste generation across different trusts with different practices. We'll then be implementing local strategies and sending out an educational toolkit and resources to try and improve our waste segregation and then ultimately measure the impact that this is having. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ryan. That's more food for thought and perhaps some slightly easier things to achieve than perhaps we've been led to believe earlier. So that's excellent. The next section is by Robin Britton. It was going to be by both of our patient representatives, and Robin is going to stand alone. So, Robin, can you come and tell us about the work you've been doing with the patient network for the NJR?
Thank you. Yes, for those who were not here earlier, my name is Robin Britton and I'm a patient representative for the National Joint Registry. Patient representatives have always played an important role for the National Joint Registry. They have been a vital link to ensure that the work of the organisation is relevant, serving the best interests of patients. To ensure that patients continue to be central to supporting the work of the NJR and their role further strengthened, it was decided last year to expand their representation through developing a patient network for greater engagement with patients, carers, and others with a personal interest in joint surgery. Currently, there are 2 patient representatives, being myself and my colleague Gillian, who can't be with us today in person. This will allow for more diverse input to support the work of the NJR. Patients are central or are at the heart of joint surgery. They are the ones who are having a surgical procedure done to them. They are the ones who can be having parts of their body modified, such as bone and cartilage removed and replaced with artificial prosthetic components being put into them. It's only right that they should have an input or say in ensuring that they get the very best from surgery and from those involved, including hospitals, surgeons, and implants, in terms of safety and outcomes. It's therefore the right thing to do to involve patients in the work of the NJR. It's nothing short of a moral duty and moral obligation to do so. It's important to have patients inside the circle or tent, inputting into work that matters to them rather than being on the outside looking in. They must be valued and empowered based on the experiences they have and what they bring. Involvement must be meaningful and not tokenistic and symbolic. In the case of the NJR, it's a partnership. Joint surgery is highly successful and commonplace routine surgery, which can meet the needs and expectations of patients, typically the primary outcomes wanted being improvement in pain and function. However, complications and incidents can and do occur. The NJR plays an important role in success rates through monitoring, analysing, reporting, and identifying issues when they occur. Evidence from the NJR data collected over the last 20 years shows increasing improvements in outcomes over this time, and in no short measure is the role of patient representatives in how the NJR goes about its work in ensuring it's in the best interests of patients. The NJR has already committed to patient input into its work with myself and my colleague Gillian as patient representatives. We are involved at different stages and different areas of the work through both being members of its steering committee and being members of its subcommittees and working groups, and also inputting into different aspects of the organisation's work streams and activities, ranging from strategy and work prioritisation through to data use and reporting, dissemination of information, and so on. An important aspect through being patients or lay people is ensuring the work and outputs such as data use and reporting is meaningful, accessible, and understandable to a wide-ranging lay audience. The nature of the NJR and the work that it does relating to orthopaedics and specifically joint surgery with data use means it is medically, scientifically, and technically language and statistics centric, and it's important to ensure from a patient perspective that the NJR is far-reaching with engagement and understanding for those being affected by or having an interest in joint surgery. The NJR therefore has patient representation embedded within it and with its work. I've been volunteering in the musculoskeletal sector for some time with different patient representative roles for different organisations. The NJR is a very good example in setting a benchmark of excellence for not just including patients in its work, but doing so in a meaningful way. However, there can be times when we are stretched with our abilities and capabilities through commitments and our health through being MSK patients. And the NJR does not have the fullest patient representative diversity that is fundamental and increasingly expected to ensure that those with different backgrounds, experiences, perspectives and skills can help carry out its work. The NJR did previously have a patient network, but this was more a collective type of group of people for more discussion rather than input with the work of the NJR. The patient network will build on current patient involvement to be a bigger representative group to support the NJR's work than currently exists, and will be open to not just patients, but carers and others with a personal interest in joint surgery, and to have a diverse and inclusive membership as possible. It will contribute to the strategic direction of the NJR, supporting important decision-making, prioritisation, and undertaking of projects and work. It will make practical recommendations so that the work of the NJR is suitably informed to continue to develop while being relevant and important to patients and with greater transparency to the public. It will be led by both existing patient representatives. The aims and objectives of the network are for greater patient care and public engagement and involvement to increase awareness of the NJR, promote its work and share evidence of good practice and information such as for those seeking joint surgery and for joint decision-making, and for involvement and input in all NJR work areas where beneficial, and for representation across NJR committees and working groups, and to develop links with patient charities, organisations and other relevant organisations to share the work of the NJR, and to help promote the value of the use of NJR registry data in different areas of research to benefit outcomes and safety, and for communication and sharing of NJR work through developing and testing public-facing tools, such as the website and social media channels. There are additional benefits and impacts beyond direct patient involvement with the work of the NJR itself. For example, use of NJR evidence for developments in surgical approaches and practices, implant design and treatment choices, and to influence policy and service provisions such as surgical access and waiting times, disparities in provision in surgery, and helping shape design future services or a care pathway. So where are we now? The current patient representatives have been working with the NJR to develop the purpose, structure, framework and resources for the network. Recruitment is now open to the network. So if you know of anyone you feel is suitable and benefit to the organisation and would be interested in joining, please do let the NJR know or point people in the right direction. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robin. Can you come and sit on the panel? Rohan, Mike, Mark, Peter, if you could all come up. We're going to have a few minutes more now for questions on this second part. So on those 3 presentations and the areas covered by those 3 presentations. If anybody has some questions, if not, then we may throw it open to a wider questioning. But initially, if you have any questions about that, nobody wants to know how we're going to make all of this carbon dioxide disappear. I thought it was quite encouraging, actually, Rohan, what you were saying, that you have made that impact simply by doing a little bit more sorting in theatre. But how much time did that take you, which you would have to provide somebody during every operation to be able to do that, presumably, unless everybody is trained to do it routinely?
Yeah, I think it's the reason I wanted to focus on this area, as you said, is because it's such an easy thing to achieve just by disposing of things in the correct bins, and doesn't involve any sort of anxiety about any increased infection risk if you're changing your practice or doing any other interventions. But in terms of the time that it takes, I think what we've established is having someone there actively segregating is sort of not practical in every theatre. But what we hope to do then is, just by providing the education and impetus and awareness about this problem, people can do this as part of their day-to-day practice. And in our theatres in the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital, what we've noticed is a simple change, such as previously, the moment the patient was brought to theatre, they would get rid of any general waste bins and only have clinical waste and hazardous waste bins around. So simply by introducing a general waste bin into each of the theatres now, we've noticed a huge difference. So just a very small intervention like that, hopefully, in different trusts can have an effect.
Good, thanks. Yes, no question.
I'm Ashok. I'm from University Hospital of Stoke-on-Trent. Question to Rohan, actually. It's a very good presentation and learned a lot. I just want to ask, have you looked the wastage produced by robotic knees and the routine standard? Is there any difference in your study?
I've got some small numbers for robotic knees, and the initial data does suggest that there's an increase in the waste produced, largely from the packaging and other things involved with draping the robot. But we haven't sort of formally looked into that just yet. The focus has been on the primary knees and hips using the traditional method. But I think it's definitely the next thing to look at as we use more robots.
We heard yesterday that it's a disaster from the point of view of disposables. So, yes, Deborah.
Thanks, Rohan. Great, and exactly what Mike and I wanted you to do. Not that we were prejudging your talk, of course, but we've got to start somewhere, haven't we? And you've shown you can make a difference. And yeah, it's not your best use of your particular time, but if you can do it, then other people can do it, and we do need to start. And the thing that I was horrified from talking to you is how we can't recycle the blessed packaging because it doesn't say recyclable on it. I mean, how idiotic is that in this current age? You know, where everything I buy from the shops has got about 5 different labels on it, and yet we can't. So I don't know how to change that, but I think, we've got to start somewhere. So thank you again, much appreciated.
I think we can probably change that by all of us lobbying, going around the stands and asking them, and I've been doing that yesterday, which of this is recyclable? And they say, well, they're all recyclable. Well, there's no packaging, there's no labelling on your packaging. So they're all going in the wrong bins. It's bonkers.
But one of the problems is that they can't get their devices put through the process in order to, say, get a UKCA mark and so forth. And as I understand it, just changing the packaging means that you have to start again, put them through that process.
Chandra Rao from Hereford. Rohan, I think you'll be the star of this panel. Sorry, no distress for others. Very topical. I was very disappointed at the BBC News saying that our Prime Minister's leaked report about clawing back on carbon emissions and making car industry. But I hope that as NHS leaders, we stick to our guns of saying, when was it again that we are supposed to be carbon neutral?
2045, I believe.
2045. Hope that doesn't change. And thank you for about the simple things like blue gloves, right? So blue gloves, which are recyclable, should be going into the recyclable bin. Is that what you said? Thank you. Just so those comments. Thank you.
Yes, next.
Thank you. Andrew Flood. In terms of patient information, there has been for some years now debate about making available individual surgeons' outcomes. And is that something that would be welcomed and beneficial to patients? And if it's done, how do you navigate the nuances and the minefields? I mean, someone may be doing lots of uni knees and have a higher revision rate, but also have higher PROMS data because of the nature of that operation. So, yeah, just value your comments.
Well, I think the answer is that we certainly are aiming in that direction, but up until now we're advised by our statisticians who know about these things, who are sitting over there, that the numbers involved and the variability in the numbers involved for individual surgeons' practice makes it very difficult to actually say that we can say with confidence that this surgeon has better outcomes than that surgeon. And our ability, the data that we collect is not particularly sophisticated at looking at the case mix in terms of the difficulty of the cases and so forth. We have some case mix adjustment, but we have areas where we know it's important which we don't collect the data. We have other areas where we know that it's important where we do collect the data, and it's so variable that it probably would undermine such advice. But yes, in principle, it is obviously in the patient's interest to know more about the outcomes of the surgeons. But if that led to the people being told these surgeons are less good when it's not true, then we think that would be doing more harm than good. And if it leads to them being told that these surgeons are less good when it is true and they can't actually find their way to see somebody else, that's perhaps not going to cause them a great deal of joy either. I think it's a very difficult topic, but it is something which we regularly review. So we can throw open to more general questions, not specific to this second session, if any of you wish to do so. And otherwise, I think we're... Mike, were you about to interject?
Well, I was just... it's another question for Rohan. I was interested yesterday in the sustainability session that really the emphasis on not so much recycling, but reusing kit. And I'm not sure that we're great at that. So have you had any thoughts on how we might reuse more kit within orthopaedics?
I thought one interesting area to look at could be implants. And as the Mr. Butter mentioned yesterday, implants that supposedly go out of date, actually, if we can prove that they're well functioning and that date is arbitrary, and actually with micro studies can show that they are not contaminated, then I think that would have a huge impact. But otherwise, I think it's difficult in a normal knee replacement to see where we can be reusing things apart from drapes and gowns. But then they have their own issues with people having their own notions about whether they increase risk of infection or not. So I think we probably need a bit more data before we can definitively say it's safe to reuse different aspects of the kit.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like you to all thank the panel and all of the people for their presentations. No, So just before you all leave, please, that was just to say goodbye to that lot. I'm going to give a brief summary and then ask our chair to come up and wrap up. So I think that we can say that there have been, you can see that the NJR has grown and developed considerably over the last 20 years. I think the depth and sensitivity of our analysis is improving, and we're able to demonstrate that. You can see that there might be a considerable benefit from various aspects of sustainability measures that we can take, and some of them are easier to introduce than perhaps we'd been worried about. I'm minded that we used to have a little rubber disc that I put on the end of a large metal rod to pressurize the cement into the acetabulum, and we used those for about 500 cases. And then one day the company said, well, we're not making any money from doing this, so those have to be now a single use only. And then for the last 10 years, we've used a single one for every case because we're not allowed by the hospital to say that we're going to reutilize something which says single use on it. And that sort of thing could be reversed at a stroke. Perhaps we'd have to pay the company a little bit more to allow us to use it 500 times. But I think there are measures that we can take, is my message. So finally, I'd like to ask Professor Sir Paul Curran, our new chair, but he's actually been in post for 18 months, to come and give a parting shot. Thank you, Sir Paul.
Thank you, and thank you for attending this session and your patience for staying with us for an hour and a half. There were various things I was going to comment on about the things that the NJR does, the size of its database and so on, but many of those have been very well covered by the speakers before me. I just want to end the session by saying in terms of the successes we've achieved them by improving continuously. Elaine referred to that right at the beginning of the session, and that there were 5 things that I'd just like to pick up on now that weren't picked up in the earlier sessions of things we're doing over the coming year. One of them is working very, very closely with the NHSC's outcome registries and patient safety programme. For those of you who are interested, there's a session on that tomorrow, which will enable us to align far more closely with a very well-funded initiative that will provide us with access to data that we might not otherwise have. We'll be investing over £1 million a year in developments that will enable us to improve our efficiency and our effectiveness. And we're accelerating our move into the world of big data, machine learning and artificial intelligence. Our first AI PhD student is about to start. We'll also strengthen the unusual governance arrangement that was alluded to at the beginning and clarify it as well, because we're an NHS advisory body. We are part of an NHSC charity, and yet half of our funding comes from outside of the NHS. So we need to make sure that works for us. And also we intend to promote the work we do with non-clinical audiences. And this is really important to us. You've heard Robin talk about the work we're doing with patients, but it's still fair to say the majority of people out there wouldn't know what the NJR is or what it does. So for those who are readers of magazines, you'll see over the next year or so we'll be out there in magazines, and for avid readers of The Lady, you'll see us in the Lady in the October issue, for example. And on that happy note, I'd like to draw the session to a close. I do hope you'll be able to join us next year, and you'll see the progress we've made. Again, thank you very much indeed, and join with me in thanking all the speakers. Thank you.